The chandeliers glittered, the tables overflowed with silverware, and the cameras were ready to capture yet another polished royal event. But no one could have predicted what was about to unfold that night. In a hall built to showcase loyalty and tradition, a young prince barely in his teens shattered centuries of obedience with one shocking refusal that left the monarchy trembling. The moment Prince George refused Camilla's blessing changed everything. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The royal banquet was supposed to be nothing more than a performance of unity. Dignitaries from across the Commonwealth gathered under the grand arches, expecting a spectacle of ceremony, speeches, and carefully scripted gestures meant to reinforce the monarchy's unbroken lineage. For decades, such banquets had served their purpose: to present the crown as untouchable, timeless, and bound by sacred ritual. Yet hidden beneath the shimmer of chandeliers, tension lurked in every glance, every pause, every carefully orchestrated move. The room looked calm, but the truth was anything but. At the center of this gathering sat the heir himself, Prince George. No longer the wide-eyed boy the public remembered from photographs, but a young man beginning to embody the weight of expectation. To the guests, he appeared poised, even serene, as if years of training had already molded him into the image of his ancestors. But behind that calm surface was a storm, a clash of loyalty and conviction that would soon break open in front of the entire world. And then there was Queen Camilla. For her, this evening carried special meaning. It wasn't merely another banquet. It was the night she intended to solidify her role, to remind the world that she wasn't a shadow lingering at the edges of the crown, but the commanding matriarch who demanded acknowledgement. Her strategy was subtle but deliberate. By insisting on a symbolic gesture, a blessing, one where George would bow and honor her publicly, Camilla sought to capture the very image that history would remember. It would not be enough for Charles to support her. She needed the heir himself to bend. The weight of tradition pressed down like iron chains. For generations, heirs had followed the same silent rules, showing deference not just to monarchs but to the consorts who carried their titles. No one questioned it, no one broke it, and as the moment approached, the audience expected the same polished submission. The ritual wasn't in the program, but it was implied, anticipated, and whispered about in the corridors long before the guests took their seats. But when Camilla extended her hand, waiting for George to acknowledge her in a move that would have been recorded as unshakable proof of her authority, the room held its breath. For a second, time seemed to slow. The young prince's hand trembled, his expression unreadable. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper yet carrying enough force to pierce the silence, George refused. Clear, firm, unshakable. The effect was instant and devastating. Gasps erupted across the hall, dignitaries turned to one another in shock, and the clicking of cameras accelerated like gunfire. What should have been a small, symbolic act of unity became a declaration of war inside the very heart of the monarchy. Camilla froze, her face caught between rage and disbelief. Charles's jaw tightened, his knuckles whitening against the table as whispers spread like wildfire. Kate's protective gaze never left her son, while William's silence was heavy with both pride and dread. In that single moment, Prince George shattered the illusion of unbreakable obedience. The monarchy, which had survived countless storms by clinging to protocol, now stood vulnerable, not to an enemy outside its gates, but to a rebellion born from within its own bloodline. But what could drive a young prince, taught to obey protocol since birth, to rebel in the most public setting imaginable? To answer that, we must peel back the layers of royal politics and hidden resentments. From the day he was born, Prince George was marked as the heir who would carry the crown into a new century. But he also inherited a silent battle, the shadow of his grandmother, Princess Diana, and the commanding presence of Queen Camilla. Raised between his mother's quiet strength and Camilla's demand for authority, George learned early that loyalty was not as simple as tradition claimed. His refusal was no accident. It was destiny. George's childhood was wrapped in the warmth of William and Catherine's determination to raise him differently. They wanted him to know Not just the weight of the crown, but the freedom of being a child who could laugh, stumble, and dream, beyond the rigid walls of protocol. He grew up surrounded by stories that were carefully selected, yet one name always hovered in the background: Diana. Though George never met her, her presence was everywhere. In the whispers of his father, in the gentle reverence of Catherine's tone, and in the sorrow that sometimes clouded family conversations. Diana's shadow lingered not as a warning but as a torch, a symbol of defiance against a system that had consumed her. But alongside this softer influence was a very different force: Camilla. She wasn't merely another adult in George's orbit. She positioned herself carefully, strategically, seeking to bind the boy to her with gestures of kindness, small tokens, and carefully chosen words. To outsiders, it seemed natural the new queen was simply guiding the future king. Yet behind closed doors, her approach was deliberate, designed to establish authority where acceptance had always been fragile. George, even as a child, sensed the difference. Her affection carried a weight, an expectation, as though her approval was a crown he was meant to wear long before his time. These quiet tensions spilled into family gatherings. What looked like polite smiles often masked deeper currents. When Camilla spoke of tradition, George noticed his mother's silence. When she attempted to steer his words in public, Catherine's hand would tighten subtly on his shoulder, as though reminding him that his loyalty did not belong to everyone who claimed it. Even as a boy, George read the room in ways that unnerved those around him. He knew the difference between love that asked nothing in return and loyalty that came with strings. William and Catherine whispered their worries when they thought he couldn't hear. Camilla's presence loomed over more than just public events. It seeped into decisions, into appearances, into the very fabric of their family life. They feared her influence might anchor George to a legacy they had spent years trying to soften, reshape, and modernize. And George, listening from behind doors left slightly ajar, carried those concerns quietly, letting them grow into convictions of his own. The seeds of defiance were planted long before the glittering banquet. Each story of Diana's courage, each quiet lesson from his mother, and every forced smile he endured from Camilla shaped him into something unexpected, a boy who saw through the illusions of royal unity. By the time he sat at that table, waiting for Camilla's hand to reach out, the choice had already been made. His act of rebellion was not a child's mistake, but the culmination of years of silent observation, inner conflict, and unspoken loyalty to a legacy he could not ignore. Yet George's rebellion wasn't just about family ghosts. It was ignited by Camilla's own ambition, a desire for recognition that had been building toward this very moment. Behind the polished smiles and polite speeches, Camilla had been orchestrating her own silent campaign. For years, she fought to turn her role from tolerated consort into unchallenged matriarch. The royal banquet was supposed to be her crowning achievement, a public display where even the future king, Prince George, would bow to her authority. But what Camilla demanded that night became the very thing that undid her. Her rise within the palace had not been simple or natural. It had been carefully engineered through persistence and strategy. Every luncheon attended, every charity she adopted, every public appearance was a calculated step toward reshaping her image. Where once she had been viewed as an intruder, Camilla had worked tirelessly to rewrite the narrative, positioning herself as indispensable to the crown. In the silence of gilded corridors, she forged alliances, pressed confidences, and reminded those around her that she was no longer a shadow, but the queen they were required to acknowledge. Central to her vision of power was a single symbolic act, the blessing ritual. Though it was not written in law or codified in ceremony, its significance was undeniable. If George, the heir, were to show public deference to her, it would seal her position in history. It would be the photograph, the moment replayed endlessly, proving she had achieved what so many said was impossible: acceptance, not just from her husband, but from the bloodline itself. Without it, her reign would forever remain tainted by whispers of disapproval and resistance. This was not a request she made lightly. Camilla had rehearsed the image in her mind countless times, the young prince, head bowed, offering her recognition as the matriarch of the royal household. She spoke of it in private with Charles, not as a suggestion, but as a necessity. These conversations were fraught with tension, for Charles knew the risk. His grandson was not a pliable figurehead. He had inherited a stubbornness from both parents and a streak of independence from Diana herself. Yet Camilla persisted, pressing him again and again, warning that without George's public submission, the monarchy would fracture under competing loyalties. Charles, torn between his wife's determination and his own unease, allowed the plan to take shape. In those tense nights before the banquet, their arguments grew sharper, their words heavier. Camilla insisted that history would not wait for George to grow into his role. The time to bind him was now. She could not afford to be patient any longer, not when her legacy still dangled precariously between acceptance and rejection. The banquet, in her eyes, was not simply an event, but the moment that would finally silence her critics. She walked into that hall with the confidence of a woman who believed victory was already hers. The stage had been set, the guests prepared, the gesture rehearsed in her mind until it gleamed like inevitability. But what Camilla failed to see was that George had been carrying his own silent resolve, one that no amount of pressure or calculated maneuvering could shake. What Camilla didn't realize was that George had already made his choice, and his decision would unleash a storm no one could contain. The moment arrived, cameras flashed, the orchestra hushed, and Camilla extended her hand for the gesture that would cement her authority. But George did not bow. Instead, with a trembling yet steady voice, he uttered words that froze the banquet in silence. In that single refusal, the heir to the throne declared war on the very woman who had fought for decades to be recognized. The tension in the room was unbearable, every eye fixed on the young prince. The ritual, though never formally scripted, was expected to be a silent performance that carried centuries of weight. For George to accept her blessing would have meant submission, a signal that the next generation recognized her authority. Guests leaned forward, breaths held, ready for the seamless act of unity they had been promised. But the air grew thick, as if everyone sensed that something was about to fracture. George hesitated at first. His small pause seemed like nerves, an innocent, the moment of delay. But then came the sudden shift. His face hardened, his eyes unflinching. His voice carried across the hall, trembling only for an instant, before steadying with the conviction of a young heir who understood exactly what he was doing. "I cannot accept this," he said, the words slicing through the silence like steel. It wasn't loud, yet it thundered louder than any speech ever could. The shock was instantaneous. Gasps erupted. Whispers darted from table to table like sparks in a dry field. Dignitaries exchanged looks of disbelief, some fumbling to make sense of what they had just heard. The orchestra froze, instruments hanging mid-air, as though even music dared not continue after such a rupture. The polished script of the night had been torn apart, and the cameras caught every second of it. Charles's fury was unmistakable. His face flushed red, his jaw clenched so tightly that those closest could see his anger threatening to explode. His reign, already fragile in the eyes of many, now stood exposed before the world, undermined not by politicians or critics, but by his own grandson. Kate's glance, by contrast, was protective, her hand subtly moving toward her son, as though shielding him from the storm she knew would follow. William sat frozen, his silence betraying an inner war, torn between pride for George's courage and dread for the consequences that would now spiral uncontrollably. Camilla, the architect of this spectacle, tried to mask the devastation. Her smile remained, but it was stretched thin, brittle, and transparent to all who watched. Behind her eyes was rage, humiliation, and a simmering desperation that no forced expression could conceal. The very moment she had hoped would crown her authority had instead shattered it, and the humiliation was irreversible. George's refusal wasn't just a boy's defiance. It was an act that carried the weight of history, the echoes of Diana's resistance, and the voice of a generation, unwilling to bow to what it did not believe in. The silence that followed was deafening, not just because of the words spoken, but because of the truths. They revealed truths the royal family had worked tirelessly to bury. But George's shocking act was more than youthful rebellion. It was the eruption of years of silent battles within the royal family. For William and Catherine, the banquet was a nightmare unfolding in real time. They had raised George to be thoughtful, strong, and loyal to truth, but never imagined he would challenge Camilla so boldly. Now, they were trapped between supporting their son's bravery and protecting the fragile unity of the monarchy. Their reactions revealed more than just parental concern. They exposed the cracks in the royal foundation. William felt the sting of betrayal in more ways than one. His son's refusal, though courageous, placed him in an impossible position. On one side stood his father, the king, demanding unquestioned loyalty and control. On the other side was George, his heir, echoing the defiant spirit of Diana and exposing the very rift William had worked so hard to conceal. The weight of loyalty pressed down on him like a crushing burden. To defend George openly would mean alienating his father, yet to rebuke him would wound his son's trust and risk erasing the values he and Catherine had fought to instill. Catherine, however, was steady. Though shock rippled across her face, she did not falter. Beneath the whispers and the fury of the moment, she stood firmly behind her son. Her glance carried both reassurance and defiance, a silent message that George would not face this storm alone. For Catherine, the monarchy had always been a structure to navigate carefully, but never at the cost of truth. Her quiet strength in that instant was not only for George but also for William, who found himself drowning in the chaos. Yet fear lingered. Fear of humiliation that stretched far beyond that glittering hall. The monarchy thrived on image, on control of perception, and George's defiance had shattered the illusion. Dignitaries were already whispering, aides already calculating how to repair the damage, and William knew that the outside world would feast on this scandal before the banquet even ended. What was meant to be a ceremony of unity was now a public spectacle of division, and every camera in the room had captured it. The danger was not only reputational but deeply personal. There was the very real risk that George would be portrayed as immature, reckless, and unfit to inherit. Enemies of the crown, critics of the monarchy, and even loyalists who feared change could seize upon this act as proof that the next generation was unstable. William and Catherine knew how ruthless the press could be, and the narrative was already spinning out of their hands. Still, beneath the panic and uncertainty, both parents recognized an unshakable truth. George's act could not be undone. His refusal had already burned itself into history, and no amount of silence or correction could erase it. What they feared most was not the moment itself, but the irreversible chain of consequences it had unleashed. The monarchy could not emerge untouched, and neither could their family. And while William and Catherine wrestled with their dilemma, King Charles faced an even greater storm, his authority unraveling before his eyes. King Charles had fought his entire life for the crown, enduring decades of waiting, controversy, and scandal. But in that single moment, his reign was challenged not by enemies abroad, nor by critics in Parliament, but by his own grandson. George's refusal struck Charles where he was weakest, the fear that his legacy would never be secure. His fury that night marked the beginning of a royal reckoning. As the hall fell into stunned silence, Charles's anger rose like a storm he could not contain. His fists clenched, his eyes narrowed, and though he forced himself to remain seated, every muscle in his body betrayed the rage boiling beneath. For a man who had spent years fighting to be respected, George's defiance felt like the ultimate betrayal. A public fracture within the family he had sacrificed everything to keep intact. The king, who had endured endless judgment from the outside world, was now confronted with rebellion from his own blood. Behind the glittering doors, once the guests had been ushered away and the orchestra silenced, the confrontation erupted. Charles demanded an explanation, his voice sharp with disbelief and fury. George, pale but unyielding, refused to recant his words. William stood caught in the middle, torn between defending his father's crown and protecting his son's courage. Catherine's calm insistence that George should not be punished only added fuel to the fire. For Charles, this was not just a family argument. It was a direct threat to his reign, one that played out in whispers and accusations that echoed down the palace halls long after the banquet ended. What made the wound deeper was the ghost that haunted him most, Diana. He could not shake the fear that her defiance, her refusal to be molded into silence, now lived on in George. In the boy's refusal, Charles heard her voice again, challenging him, undermining him, forcing the world to look at the monarchy's fractures. He had spent years trying to bury the past, to rewrite the story, but now it was alive again, embodied in the heir who would one day replace him. The advisors swarmed quickly, warning that the monarchy could not survive the appearance of division. They urged Charles to seize control of the narrative, to frame George's actions as childish, impulsive, a mistake unworthy of attention. But Charles hesitated. He was not only a king, he was a father and a grandfather. To crush George publicly might protect the crown, but it would break his family beyond repair. To remain silent, however, risked the monarchy's credibility and his own authority. The choice tore at him, and no matter which path he considered, he saw only ruin ahead. The banquet, which had begun as a triumph, now became a symbol of his weakness. It would be remembered not for speeches or alliances, but for the moment when his grandson dared to defy him. Charles had fought too long for the crown to watch it slip through his fingers. Yet that night, as whispers spread across the globe, it became clear. His grip on power was fading. But Charles was not the only one shaken. Camilla's humiliation demanded retaliation, and she would not go quietly. Camilla was not a woman accustomed to public defeat. In the hours after the banquet, her allies whispered, her anger simmered, and her plan for revenge began to take shape. If George had humiliated her before the world, she would remind him and the entire royal family that she still held power. But in seeking to strike back, Camilla only deepened the chasm between herself and the future of the monarchy. Behind closed doors, her fury boiled over. She demanded explanations, demanded control, demanded that Charles act with the full weight of his crown. To her, George's defiance could not be dismissed as a childish slip. It was treasonous in its symbolism. Every word, every pause, every tremor in that boy's voice echoed like a challenge to everything she had fought for. Camilla had clawed her way into acceptance, and she would not watch it slip away because of a grandson who dared to say no. Her first demand was clear. Charles must reprimand George. She pressed her husband relentlessly, urging him to make an example of the boy. A firm hand, she argued, would show the world that no heir, no matter how beloved, could humiliate the queen without consequence. Yet Charles hesitated. The thought of punishing George only widened the fracture between him and William, and it risked pushing the public towards sympathy for the young prince. Camilla, however, was unmoved. To her, weakness was more dangerous than backlash. And so, the leaks began. Whispers to favored journalists painted George not as a brave truth-teller, but as reckless, disrespectful, and spoiled. Anonymous briefings suggested his behavior was unbecoming of a future king. In the days that followed, headlines began to appear, questioning the boy's maturity and hinting that the monarchy faced a dangerous problem in its heir. Camilla believed this strategy would turn the tide back in her favor, but instead, it exposed her desperation. Her vengeful focus did not stop with the press. Catherine, ever the shield for her children, became Camilla's immediate target. Behind palace doors, sharp words were exchanged. Camilla accused her of encouraging defiance, of poisoning George's mind with loyalty to Diana's ghost rather than respect for the throne. Catherine, calm but unyielding, refused to back down, insisting that her son had spoken from conviction, not manipulation. William, trapped in the middle yet again, bore the brunt of Camilla's anger as she accused him of cowardice for not controlling his own household. Even the advisors, who had once stood firmly behind her, began to waver. They warned Camilla that her image, already fragile, was at risk of crumbling completely if she pushed too far. They urged restraint, counseling her to allow the scandal to fade rather than feeding it with her retaliation. But Camilla would not hear it. To her, retreat was defeat, and defeat was unthinkable. She refused to accept that her authority, once so carefully built, was now slipping like sand through her fingers. But even as Camilla plotted her response, Public opinion was shifting in a direction she could never control. What the palace saw as humiliation, the people saw as heroism. Across the nation, headlines blazed with images of young George standing firm. To the public, he was no longer just a boy. He was the heir who dared to defy. In that single refusal, George became the embodiment of Diana's courage and the voice of a new generation demanding truth over tradition. By the morning after the banquet, the media had already crowned him with a new title, the People's Prince. Columnists praised his bravery, arguing that he had shown a wisdom far beyond his years. Newspapers splashed his defiant moment across their front pages, painting him not as a reckless child, but as a figure of integrity who spoke truth to power. Where the palace sought to control the story, the press amplified it, celebrating George as the future king who refused to compromise his principles. On social media, the reaction was electric. Clips of George's refusal went viral within hours, shared and reposted with captions of admiration. Supporters around the globe echoed the same sentiment. At last, a royal who represented honesty over performance, conviction over compromise. Millions joined the conversation, transforming a single act into a worldwide statement of defiance. For every whisper inside the palace, there was a roar outside it, declaring George not only courageous, but necessary. It wasn't long before comparisons to Princess Diana surged to the forefront. Commentators drew clear parallels between Diana's rejection of royal conformity and George's refusal to bow to Camilla. The image of Diana, once labeled the People's Princess, was invoked again and again, with many suggesting that her spirit lived on through her grandson. This link between past and present strengthened George's standing, for it tied his courage to a legacy of compassion and truth that the world still revered. Public demonstrations soon followed. Crowds gathered outside royal residences, holding signs and chanting, "Bravo, Prince George!" What began as a scandal was transformed into a movement, as ordinary citizens saw in him the promise of a monarchy that could be honest, humble, and human. For the first time in years, the public's passion for the crown ignited not because of duty, but because of belief in a boy who had dared to challenge it. The momentum spilled far beyond Britain. International outlets seized the story, framing George as a global symbol of youthful defiance and moral strength. From Europe to America, from Asia to Africa, commentators called him a modern figure of hope, a reminder that even in the most rigid traditions, change could be born from courage. The monarchy, which had always relied on public loyalty, now faced a truth it could not ignore. The tide was shifting, and George had become the current, pulling it forward. But while the world cheered, inside the palace the walls were closing in, and a final confrontation was inevitable. The banquet was not the end, it was the beginning. In George's refusal, a new story of the monarchy was written, one where the future crown would not bow to the past. The battle lines were drawn, Camilla clinging to a fading throne, and George stepping into his destiny. What remained unanswered was not whether the monarchy would change, but how far George was willing to go to make it happen. From that night onward, the banquet was remembered not for its golden splendor or speeches of unity, but for the fracture it revealed. Historians and commentators alike declared it a turning point, the moment where silence gave way to defiance. It was no longer a tale of tradition carried unbroken, but one of challenge and resistance. George's refusal became more than a scandal. It became a declaration that the old ways would no longer be accepted without question. As weeks turned into months, George's image only grew stronger. No longer confined to the role of a child in training, he was spoken of as a leader in making a symbol of reform, of honesty, and of courage. Young people across the nation held him up as a voice of their generation, one unafraid to demand change even when standing against the very institution meant to shape him. The heir had become the embodiment of a future crown that promised something different, something raw and unpolished but undeniably real. For Camilla, however, the consequences were devastating. The carefully built legacy she had fought decades to achieve was unraveling. What was supposed to be her crowning moment had instead cemented her as the monarch consort who was publicly rejected by the future king. Every attempt she made to restore her authority only reminded the world of the wound she could not heal. Where she once held power in her grasp, she now clung desperately to its remnants. William and Catherine, though shaken by the chaos, began to see their son's defiance as more than reckless courage. They understood it as a glimpse into the kind of monarchy George believed in, and the kind of monarchy the people seemed ready to embrace. Quietly, they began to align behind him, supporting his convictions rather than silencing them. In doing so, they not only protected George but strengthened the very values that could carry the crown into the next century. And at the center of it all was Charles, caught in an impossible balancing act. As king, he could not appear weak. As a father, he could not alienate William. As a grandfather, he could not destroy George's spirit. Every path led to loss, and every decision deepened the fractures around him. His reign, once meant to heal old wounds, now became defined by a war between the crown he wore and the crown his grandson would one day inherit. This was not the end of the struggle but the prologue to a larger battle George against tradition itself. His refusal was only the first strike, the opening move in a conflict that would determine not only his destiny, but the survival of the monarchy, as it was known. The world waited, breathless, to see how far he would go, and whether the old order could withstand the force of a generation that no longer feared the truth. And as the nation whispered, "Bravo, Prince George," one truth became clear: the crown would never be the same again. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.